In the history of how nations die, there is usually the sound of cannon fire, the rhythmic marching of boots, or the deafening screaming of shells. But in the 19th century, the greatest empire of the Middle East was dismantled not by soldiers, but by accountants. It was conquered not with gunpowder, but with compound interest, marking the story of the first true debt trap in modern history, where the Ottoman Empire, a superpower that had terrified Europe for centuries, was slowly suffocated by the banks of London and Paris. This is a cautionary tale that echoes loudly in our modern world because it demonstrates a brutal geopolitical truth. You do not need to invade a country to own it. You simply need to hold its mortgage. To understand how this tragedy unfolded, we must look at the Ottoman Empire in the middle of the 19th century, where to any outside observer it still appeared to be a titan stretching from the Balkans across Anatolia and down to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. The Sultan in Istanbul ruled over millions and sat on a throne commanding the crossroads of the world. But beneath this surface of imperial majesty, the foundation was rotting away because the empire was economically sick. While Britain and France were undergoing the Industrial Revolution and building steam engines, factories, and railways, the Ottoman economy remained frozen in a medieval agrarian past, a land of peasants and craftsmen trying to compete in a world of machines. The treasuries were chronically short of cash, the tax system was archaic and inefficient, and for centuries, the Ottomans had solved their cash flow problems by debasing their currency or confiscating wealth. But in the modern era, these medieval tricks no longer worked. The empire needed massive capital to build a modern army to defend itself against the predatory Russian Empire to the north, yet for a long time the sultans resisted the temptation to borrow from the West due to a deep cultural and religious aversion to usury. In 1853, the dam finally broke when the Russian Empire invaded Ottoman territory, sparking the Crimean War and creating a conflict of massive scale that the Ottomans could not afford to fight alone. Britain and France stepped in to help, but they also sent bankers because the war was costing millions of gold liras that the Sultan did not have. In 1854, Sultan Abdul-Majid I signed the first foreign loan agreement with a syndicate of British and French bankers, a move presented as a lifeline, but which was actually the first shackle of the golden handcuffs. The terms of the loan were predatory, as the bankers set the issue price at 80, meaning for every £100 of debt signed, the Sultan only received 80 in cash, while being forced to pay interest on the full 100. This original sin of Ottoman finance meant they were borrowing at punishingly high effective rates while receiving far less than they owed. Yet the cash that arrived in Istanbul felt like a miracle that paid the army and eventually helped defeat the Russians. The Sultan discovered a magic trick. With a simple signature in London, he could summon fleets of gold, and he and the Ottoman elite quickly became addicted to this forbidden fruit of easy credit. They looked at the shining capitals of London and Paris and felt a deep sense of inferiority, wanting to prove they were not the sick man of Europe, but a civilized and wealthy power. Instead of spending borrowed money on factories, irrigation, or education, they spent it on prestige and imperial vanity, specifically the Dolmabahce Palace. This staggering edifice on the Bosporus was filled with 14 tons of gold leaf and the world's largest crystal chandelier, featuring crystal staircases and silk carpets, all built with borrowed money, while Anatolian peasants used wooden plows. The cost of the palace alone was equivalent to a quarter of the empire's yearly tax revenue, and to pay for it, the Sultan went back to the bankers repeatedly throughout the 50s and 60s. The bankers were happy to lend because they were making fortunes on commissions, assuming that Britain and France would never let such a geographically important empire fail. By the late 1860s, the financial situation turned into a classic Ponzi scheme, where the empire was taking new loans just to pay the interest on the old ones, effectively digging a hole to fill a hole. Debt payments began to consume the entire budget, rising from 15% in 1860 to over 50% by 1870, meaning half of every dollar collected from fishermen or farmers was leaving the country instantly to pay bondholders in London. The state was being hollowed out, leading them to turn to local loan sharks known as the Galata bankers, who led money at suicidal short-term rates of 20% or higher. Sultan Abdulaziz added to this burden by building a massive ironclad navy, making it the third largest in the world on paper, but the ships sat rusting in the Golden Horn because there was no money for coal. The tipping point arrived in 1873 when a global financial panic dried up European capital just as a catastrophic drought struck the heartland of Anatolia, causing crops to fail and sheep to die. The revenue stream collapsed, but the debt remained fixed, leading to the Decree of Ramadan in October 1875, where the government announced it would cut debt payments in half. This default shook the financial pillars of Europe, wiping out the savings of middle-class investors and turning the Western press against the thieving Turks. This financial weakness immediately invited Russian aggression, leading to the Russo-Turkish War of 1877, a disaster that saw Russian troops march to the suburbs of Istanbul. The humiliating peace treaty imposed a massive war indemnity of 800 million francs, placing the empire in an impossible position where it owed more than its entire economy was worth. Sultan Abdul Hamid II ascended the throne of a bankrupt, defenseless corpse, waiting for the Europeans to carve up his lands. But the British and French chose a soft conquest instead. In 1881, the Decree of Muharram established the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, or the OPDA, a foreign corporation run by European bankers that loomed over Istanbul like a fortress. The Sultan surrendered the empire's most valuable revenues, silk, salt, fishing, spirits, and tobacco, directly to this corporation, which hired 5,000 of its own armed tax collectors to siphon wealth from the Ottoman people. This state within a state was incredibly efficient, using modern accounting to extract 1/3 of the total revenue of the empire for the benefit of foreign creditors, leaving the Ottoman government with only the scraps. The state remained perpetually poor, unable to modernize or invest in its people, while the Sultan became a puppet who had to ask bankers for permission to build a single school. This opened the door for Germany, who proposed the Berlin-Baghdad Railway as a friendship project, but it too was a trap of steel chains, with extortionate contracts and rights to all minerals along the tracks. By 1910, the empire was effectively a German economic colony, pushing Europe towards World War I as Britain and France watched their influence slip away. In 1914, the Young Turk movement made a fatal gamble by joining Germany in the war, hoping a victory would cancel their debts and abolish the OPDA. They felt a brief rush of freedom when they expelled the foreign directors, but the gamble failed, the empire was destroyed, and yet the debt survived. Even when Mustafa Kemal Ataturk founded the Turkish Republic in 1923, the Treaty of Lausanne forced the new nation to inherit the mortgage of the dead empire, arguing that a successor state inherits the debt of its predecessor. The poor, war-torn republic spent its first 30 years sending millions abroad to pay for the reckless spending of the 19th century sultans, making the final payment only on May 25, 1954. It took exactly 100 years to pay for the mistake of 1854, proving that money is never neutral and every loan is a tether. The Ottoman debt trap remains the ultimate lesson in financial dependency, showing that the most effective way to destroy an empire is to lend it money it can never repay. Sovereignty is not just about flags and borders, it is about solvency, because if you don't own your debt owns you.